So yes, I was saying to you, we're going to discuss the work of Carmen Herrera, Lygia Clark, and Lygia Pape, and the dark secrets of minimalism. So it was the 8th of May of 1945, and the war in Europe had ended. And like many artists of the time, many artists that survived the war were asking one question that would revolutionize or that would change the role and the role of art history for the following years. What is the role of art after the war? How does art make sense after Hiroshima or the Holocaust had existed? And for me, this is really important to think about because art is never dissociated with what's happening economically, politically in our world. And I know we can all think about this today based on what we're living. And the lives of these three artists show us that. So at the time, Carmen Herrera was living in New York. She was struggling to be visible in a city that continued to ignore her. She was rejected in 1944 of the exhibition in an exhibition in New York called Modern Cuban Painters, and in a way that made her feel that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. You can see her, she's the one that is in the middle of this picture that I'm showing you here. I felt she felt this way because her solution to that particular question was too distant to what other artists from that same generation were proposing. The distance became practically an abysm when something incredible happened. Carmen Herrera was developing this type of artwork that we see here in the right, but at the same time, an art critic called Clement Greenberg, in an article for the Nation newspaper, in an article that he named himself Art, was targeting this following artist as the most inspiring artist and the best artist of his generation. For him, Pollock was giving a solution that was targeted to enlightenments of what was happening after World War II. And it was an artist that was focusing his art experience towards himself. And he was, in Greenberg's words, not afraid of being ugly. And it was a gesture that was going to define the aesthetics of Cold War North America in a way. An aesthetic that it was going to be focused in the individual, in freedom and the individual sovereignty, and it was an aesthetics for capitalism. So imagine being Carmen Herrera and thinking and painting like she was doing here in this image in the left, whereas artists on the right and her generation were painting like Pollock in the right. She felt like, and as many critics told her at the time, that in a way she was not there in the right place and at the right time, right? Miles away, in Brazil, after withdrawing the troops from Italy, the Brazilian government in 1946 started to shift their way towards democracy and development. They signed the new constitution, replacing the dictatorship that was happening with Getúlio Vargas, and it opened a new time of optimism, industrialization, urbanization in Brazil that changed the aesthetics of Brazil as well. So these two images that I'm showing you here is the way the architecture shifted towards the brutalist architecture and minimalist architecture at the time. It's interesting to highlight, and I want you to remember this particular point for further down the line in the presentation. During the 1945 and 1946, during the time of the dictatorship, the Communist Party was banned, right? And after 1946, the Communist Party acquired legal status in Brazil. So we have to see all these different situations that were happening in Brazil and how they affected the work of Lygia Pape and Lygia Clark at the time. So although the experiences of Lygia Pape and Lygia Clark were completely different to what Carmen Herrera was living, their conclusions were not that far off, and we're going to see how. In order to understand their conclusions, we need to travel back in time to the end of World War I. And I wonder if you are asking yourself, why are you seeing these two pictures that I'm showing you here? At the end of World War I, artists were not biased just yet to this idea that art could actually still create it could be a mechanism for social redemption. That idea that art could change the world was not yet questioned. And in the Netherlands, a group of artists that afterwards called themselves concrete artists were conceiving a new way that art could reunite the whole human race. They wanted to create a universal language that could be understood no matter your race, your nationality, your religion, in a way, a universal language. And in that sense, the only language that could potentially be universal and not be misunderstood and be objective in a way was, after all, mathematics and geometry. So for them, geometry was the closest thing and the closest mechanism that would allow us to have like a universal understanding of existence. They wanted to remove the figurative world and reduce it into lines, squares, and primary colors. And that's why the emphasis was in the formal aspect and not in the content. It was purposely apolitical. They wanted to move away from politics and focus on the shapes themselves, right? And this is why they call themselves concrete artists. They didn't want it to be abstract, just abstract, because abstraction can be many things. If you see the picture of Pollock that I showed you before, that is also abstraction. So if we reduce themselves, it was something else. They wanted to be focused on geometry in a way, in a language that could be an example for every human being. This understanding of the world and this pursuit of this universal was not yet questioned. And it was a pursuit that many philosophers at the time were looking for, and that started many years before. But that was then questioned when World War II came to be. With the arrival of World War II, this idea of the pursuit of the universal, of perfection, of purity, became a similar drive to the same pursuit of the perfection of race and the perfection of human race that became very problematic in World War II. So in a way, there was something missing in their aesthetics. Their work had to be placed too objective. We needed to go back to the subject because the subject needed as well to regain their responsibility and regain their responsibility to what happened in the war. So at that time, Carmen Herrera in 1946 was placing these questions in her paintings. She was raising those questions in her painting. She met the abstract expressionists, like the ones that I showed you before in like Pollock and Bernard Newman. And they told her like, yes, you're not abstract enough, because for them, this, what I'm showing you here, for them was not abstraction. Abstraction was for them more related to the expression that they were developing. But she wanted to find an order to all this chaos that was happening around the world. She wanted to reconcile this individual drive with and also a collective drive. So she, like many other artists of her generation, she traveled to Paris in 1948. And at that moment, we need to realize the war had ended and many artists had fled to Paris, including American veterans, to study there and learn from the old masters with the money of the GI Bill. It was then she discovered Les Cahiers de Salon de Réalité Nouvelle, where she saw the work of this concrete artist that I mentioned before. And she saw like the importance of this pursuit of the universal and this pursuit of geometry and mathematics. But we need to see that she had seen something else beforehand. She had seen also the work of the abstract expressionists. And so she in her mind, in her brain, whether she was intending this or not, she was reconciling these two ideas of this fight towards the universal and the collective and the individual, sorry. So in this next paintings that I'm going to show you here, it's going to, and not this painting, sorry, I'm going to go back one slide in a minute. So it was funny because it's really interesting because she had an understanding with Bernard Newman, as I said before, and Bernard said, no, she is not as abstract as she wanted to be, but for her, he was a type of guy that he thought and then she did. And she was a type of person that she did and then she think about it. But she was conceiving and she was developing a type of ideas that would give back the interpretation and responsibility that the subject lost in this process. So her paintings started to reflect what the Austrians and German philosophers and psychiatrists define as Gestalt. So this is why I want to take you to this following slide. You might have seen this in games and different books and social media. I wonder if you have ever done this game of whether you see a young woman or an old woman, or this one that you see here in the bottom left of the two faces and the vase. According to Gestalt psychology, our mind fills up the gaps of these pictures and reads the picture as a unity rather than a bunch of individual marks. So we see like examples of there are different rules. We see an example of similarity, continuation. So if you see here, for example, in the bottom right, you see an example of continuation, how our brain creates this line despite the different of colors. You see an example of closure. You see it in the top, in the middle, where you see our brain fills and creates this triangle that not necessarily exists. Yes, I'm seeing this. I'm sorry, I'm seeing someone's video. Thank you for that. The objective, so the idea with the Gestalt theory is that the objective reality stops being away from the object and becomes part of the individual. We as viewers are part, and with our environments, with our personal experiences, we need, the work of art needs us to exist. The work depends on us. So we can see this in this work that she did. This two, for example, we're going to take these examples of this two, the figure ground and the closure example, in the work of Carmen Herrera. So in this work of Carmen Herrera that she developed in 1951, sorry, I wanted to get the date right. You see these two principles of Gestalt psychology of figure ground and closure. The figure ground rule is the famous two-face dilemma. So if you see two faces, it's because you see that the background is white, right? And if you see a vase, the background is black. So your mind is the one that actually makes this decision. In these paintings, you see a similar way. You see some figures in red, orange, and black, and you don't know which one is the background and which one is the figure itself. You are the one that decides, okay, the background is actually the black space, or the background is actually the red space. It's your job to decide, and you're the one that completes the picture. In a similar way, we see the closure law, and you see the circle that we can see in the middle of the painting. She did not draw a circle. She created a series of figures that our brain creates and finishes the circle. And all this exploration of the rules gave our brains our responsibility back, and in a way allow her to create what we call optic illusions, like the ones we see in these paintings over here. And in a way, it's funny that we call them illusions, because in a way they are creating by our minds, but they are also an important part of their painting. It's very important that we see this. I'm sorry, I got a bit confused by the chat. So we cannot understand these pictures without the illusions that we are created in our brains. The reality is both objective and subjective. And we see that these paintings are bringing this tension back in order. It's not purely objective. Our minds are part of the painting as well. And although it might not be too obvious when we look at her paintings, how they actually resolved the tension that occurred after World War II. But they were able to give us an example of how we conceive a universal reality and at the same time give the individual back its individuality, despite I'm being too repetitive, but back its responsibility and its action. And what strikes me the most is that her paintings were developed, if you see the dates, at the end of the 40s and the 50s. And she started to structure a movement that will become famous in the 60s and the 70s. For me, it's frustrating because she set up the grounds what was then to become a massive philosophical turn that will take Americans and Europeans more than decades to make, maybe a decade later to make. And it was odd because she always felt at the wrong place at the wrong time, because she was constantly compared against Pollock, then against all the abstract expressionists. And it would take artists like Frank Stella, Ellsworth Kelly, Donald John to create this movement that was later be called minimalism, but it would become an American movement, a North American movement created by an elite group of male artists. It never was named a Cuban or a Latin movement. They would never say that Carmen Herrera was the pioneer of this movement. Rather, minimalism was glorified by Hal Foster and saying and glorifying this work of Donald Judd and Frank Stella, despite the fact that she started to conceive the same philosophical turn decades before. And it's sad that her role was only realized when she was 80, and where this type of aesthetics were already known and people were already used to this aesthetics. So when her paintings came to be, a lot of people saw that, oh yes, I've seen this before. Of course, you've seen it in Franca Stella that did the same painting, but 20 years after she actually made it, which is very frustrating. But this is what actually happens, and I cannot do anything about it. And on a similar note, and a similar dramatic experience, we see the work of Lygia Clark and Lygia Pape. And in order to analyze their work, I need to acknowledge first this artist. And on a side note, their next webinar will be about her. So I'm not going to delve too much into this, but still I need to mention her. And we need to see the influence that happened with Tarsila do Amaral. Tarsila Amaral was a woman that she was Brazilian, and she went to live in Paris in the 20s, and she was married to a guy called Oswald de Andrade, and she made this particular painting that we see here, and it's called Ava Poru, which means the man that eats people, in a way, aka cannibalism. They were using like the 2P tradition in order to develop a concept of a man that eats someone else, but you would only eat someone else that you want to acquire their own power, to make it your own. It's a type of gesture that would allow you to grow yourself by acquiring the abilities and the power of the other. And this is something that inspired her husband to write the Anthropophagic Manifesto, which would then in turn try to create a Caribbean revolution, eating European modernity, internalizing and making it our own in a way. But it is a process that involves digestion. It's a process that involves the flesh. It's an eating process that involves an embodiment of modernity, but is making it our own in a different way from the European modernity at the time. And we have to have this in mind for what this artist, Lygia Clark and Lygia Pape, will do decades later. So, as I mentioned before, during the 40s and the 50s, there was a process in Brazilian history of optimism and development, industrialization, that created a particular aesthetics, and in creating this type of idea of an idea for art to be apolitical. That's why in Sao Paulo, a group of artists that decided, and poets mainly, that decided to follow in a way what was happening, as I mentioned before, with this concrete artist that I showed you before from the Netherlands. They started to follow the same type of lines, focusing on the form rather than the content. And I'm going to show you a work by Lygia Pape here, which I find absolutely revolutionary. But if you see it, you might not notice its revolution, and I'm going to show you why in a minute. So, like most of her works, we need to get a bit of background before. So, as I mentioned before, these artists, this group of poets and artists from Sao Paulo, were following the lines of the concrete artists like Max Wiel and Theo van Doesburg, this Netherlands artist that I showed you before. And a side note that I wanted you to remember before, I wanted you to remember that at the time, the Communist Party was now legal, and they were using the same strategies that was used by Russia in order to use art for their political agenda. So how did they do that? They created wood carving clubs. So wood carving is this technique where you take a piece of wood, you carve it, and then this has allowed you to reproduce multiple times the same image, right? And it's really good because if you make one image, it's not like a painting that it would take you a year to make. You do this image once, it might take you X amount of time, but then you can reproduce the same image innumerable times, as many as you wanted, right? So this particular prints that we see here, I'm going to say print, but this is a mistake. I should not call them print, and I'm going to explain to you why in a minute. This particular pieces that we see here, Lygia Pape developed them in these wood carving clubs. And it's really interesting because she wanted to create this revolution from the beginning. And the reason that I told you in a minute that I didn't want it to call them print is because she purposely named them paintings. She wanted to make them unique. She wanted to break this idea of reproduction, and in a way bring back the aura of the artwork itself. And that being said, she only made one of each. So each print is unique. She wanted to make these prints as paintings, right? And if you see, because it's made in a wood, yes, you see these geometrical shapes, and you see the same line of thought of this formal process and this formal way of thinking. But the attention, and for her, the attention that she wanted to give was in the wood itself, in the skin of the wood. And it's really interesting because if you see, it also becomes very flesh-like. And again, this is important of the embodiment of the work, like what Tarsila Damaran was doing, the need to embody the flesh, to feel, to almost like sense the work itself and not just see it. And finally, another thing that for me is very revolutionary about this work is called Untitled, but she is actually named after in a series called Teselares. I said weaving in English, but it actually, Teselares mean also not just weaving, but means like fabric itself. And it's really interesting because weaving is a technique that has been fighting with the art world to be considered an art. Many still consider weaving a craft. And as we know, craft, for many people, are like what they call low art, not necessarily high art. Therefore, it does not have the same value as art. So that being said, you can see like pieces of weaving that is sold by X amount of money, but if they call themselves art, they can sell for billions of dollars around the world. And unfortunately, because it was a craft, it was also a craft that it was associated with a type of gender, which are women. And again, it placed them at the lowest of the low. And by her making a print of weaving, she's trying to like put this new idea on the top of the line to reunite this craft into this art world and say, okay, this is worth it. This is worth being seen. We need to raise it and consider it high art. Sorry, I don't know why I'm receiving all these messages. So a similar shift was made by Lygia Clark. So I need to tell you this. I want to observe the work of Lygia Clark and Lygia Pape like in a parallel, because in a way, they work together in many aspects. They created the same movement that was in a way against what was happening in Sao Paulo. They were in Rio creating a new perspective. That's why they call themselves concrete artists. So it was a new type of concrete artist. But Lygia Clark wanted to do this other shift. I wanted to go back here just to tell you how they use the same influence, but never mind. So we go with the same twist that Lygia Clark did in this work of art. And this work I find really incredible. And as you see, we see like this new pursuit to break the boundaries of the formal world. And we see this as a new type of construction, right? So one of the things that I want you to see in this particular work is the little hinges that you see that connects it. I wouldn't call this a sculpture. I don't know how would you call it, but I wouldn't call this a sculpture because it's modular, it's united. And one of the things that she wants to imply with this sculpture is actually you can move it. It's really interesting because she called it bichos. These are little creatures that they are created by each viewer. We are supposed to intervene and model the little bichos, the little bugs, into our own sculpture, into our own ideas. So again, bringing back this concept of touch, of fingers, of embodiment into the work of art, which is really interesting. We are the ones that need to intervene. This is not just formal and this pure aspect of geometry. No, it's the individual taking place and actively changing the sculpture. So it's interesting because we break the space. The sculpture is no longer an objective space. It's actually in our personal space. We intervene in the work of art, which is really interesting. And we see this, like you see, this is another example of her bicho. So the idea is for you to create this new notions at the time. And she was breaking the line even with her paintings. Her paintings, as you see, they're very modular and they look like constructions, like breaking, like turning back to this idea of gestalt. I don't know how to pronounce them. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it badly, but this idea of how our brains fill up the gaps, but also creates a bit of movement. I think she goes a bit like different from Carmen Herrera because all her paintings relate to this embodiment of the work. And I feel this is what makes them different. And her paintings and her objects, I wouldn't call them sculptures, relate something that goes beyond a static place, but implies in our mind that it will move and it will continue to be. And in a sense, we can see the same thing with this beautiful work of Lygia Pape that for me is absolutely incredible. This is called the Book of Creation. Let me introduce you. The Book of Creation is a modular book that instead of pages, it has objects like this. So each page is a sculpture in a sense. And it's very beautiful because not only is she incorporating the sculpture and in a space, and then our bodies, because we need to modulate them, we need to play them and make them happen, but she's already also incorporating something that was never there before, which is the horizon, the event, the environment around. She's incorporating three different aspects to the object itself, the subject, the viewer, and the reader, because we need to understand this is a book, so we are supposed to be reading. She's playing with this idea of objects and words. The words are not written, but we see them. And we're not only seeing them, we are activating the object itself by placing it somewhere in our environment. And we see here in this picture, on the top right, she's incorporating one of the pages of the books, and this is how she did it at the time. She would go around the city, because we need to understand at the time, yes, there were women that both Lygia Clark and Lygia Pape were like well known at the time as artists, but we need to understand that not a lot of them were exhibited. So a great way to show your work is actually do it in the street and be a performance, which is something that Lygia Clark and Lygia Pape were working together. This idea of crossing the borders of what it used to be a painting, what it used to be a sculpture, and what it used to be a performance, and mix them all together. Trying to do this turn that Tarsila Amaral presented and eat our own modernity and create something new. We're creating something with our bodies, and each reader, each gesture creates a new sculpture, creates a new body of work, creates a new work of art. So now the work of art is no longer objective, but it has some type of objective mind, because it's still very geometrical, it's still an object, and it's still very rational, but it's completely changed by our own experiences and how we modulate it and how we create it. This work I find absolutely beautiful. And precisely this is why it takes one step further. Lygia Clark, I'm sorry, this might be confusing because both of them are called Lygia. Lygia Clark then incorporates this need of the viewer, and this work again is absolutely beautiful. It's called Caminando, or Caminando. I don't know how to pronounce this in Portuguese. So basically what she did is she took a big line of paper, created an infinite, and she played them together, and then she started to cut in the middle. And this gesture, just cutting in the middle and walking, literally, like breaking the boundary of what is a performative act, because we see that this is a performance, but it's also creating an object, and it's also activating the object. The object is no longer static, it's activating by the gesture of the viewer and the actor itself, and then the viewers that were seeing her perform this particular time. But I want you to show, and I want to end this class today. I don't know how long have I gone through, but with two pieces of work that for me, it transformed my life. I have to admit, when I'm a super famous art historian, I would probably just make a book about this particular work. For me, this work revolutionized so many things in our lives as female artists, in my perspective. Sorry to be so biased, but I need to, okay, brilliant. To say this is called Owowo. So basically Lygia Pape she did a performance in the beach where she's coming out of a white cube. And for me, this is very interesting because this work has been read in many different ways. You see, I'm showing you here in the left part of the screen. You see the process of she's coming out of the box of this white cube in the beach, and some people have interpreted how many women at the time, because they were performers, they were readdressing things that were for them to decide of how they wanted to see their own reproduction, their own maternity, their own birth. And these ideas of this, we need to understand this was in the 60s when second wave feminism was allowing women to say to the world, I want to talk about these issues. No, I don't want these issues to be talked by anyone else but me, because it's my own body. But I feel that this work goes a step further. And as you see, she's coming out of a white cube. She's again going forward with this idea of this pure form, and this pure form that was supposed to be far behind what the constructivist and the concrete artist wanted to be. But it is a particular type of form. It's a white cube. And I want to ask you all to think, when was the last time you heard this phrase, the white cube? Many of you, some, if you live in London, you know there's a gallery called the White Cube. And next time you go to an exhibition, look how the artworks are being displayed. And usually they are displayed inside a white cube, because nowadays most galleries are white cubes with white walls, white ceiling. Everything is very aseptic. This is very contemporary. We need to realize that this way of displaying and this way of exhibiting did not exist 200 years ago. If you go, I don't know, if you go to the National Gallery in London, or if you go to the Louvre in Paris, you would see that the walls were filled with this wallpaper and decorations around the artworks. Whereas now everything is very aseptic, everything is very white, and it becomes like this institutional space, an institutional space that at the time did not accept women. And in a way, this is for me why it's so important, this gesture. She's coming out not just an egg, but a white cube, an institutional space. She's with her gesture saying, we're creating something new. We are developing a new idea of art, and that in a way comes from the past, reunites all these different ideas and places our ideas in the middle. And one of the things that I wanted to say, why all these different gestures started to occur, and why all these different gestures, I want to see the date, it started to occur in this particular times, and especially this one in 1967, is because something happened in Brazil in 1964 that changed also the history of art in Brazil at the time. We need to realize, and we go back to what I started in this conference, of the relationship between art and economy, art and politics, art and society. At the time, as you may have noticed, and I told you at the beginning, during the 40s and the 50s, Brazil was living a time of optimism, modernity, industrialization, and so on. But in 1964, the dictatorship appeared. And the dictatorship that arrived was a very technocratic dictatorship. It was a dictatorship that, in a way, kind of validated the language that these artists were developing and used the same language. They assumed the same formal language, apolitical language. And in a way, the artists started to realize, oh my God, we're following the same lines, and they all changed their aesthetics dramatically. So Lygia Pape, Lygia Clark, Elio Tizica, and all these different members that were part of this group called Neo-Concretism changed their artworks, and most of them moved either to installations, performances, and realized that art needed to be political, that this idea for the formal, just for the formal, is not enough. The individual needs to be there. It was totally made into possible here, and all these different gestures that I showed you before gave it back, like the individual, the power back. But here, it completely changed, and it said we need to move away from that, and we need to be political, because it was a time that they needed to be political. And this is why afterwards, and again, this is something that we're going to talk in the next class, in Brazil, there was a new movement called the New Objectivity. It was an art that needed to be political for the time and needed to resist what was happening politically in Brazil at the time, with the dictatorship, with the censorship that these artists were living. And many of them had to flee the country, and they had to live somewhere else because of the political situation that they were living. but something rested, and in a way, like, this is the latest work that we see of Lygia Pape right now. This is a work that she made in 1991. And it's beautiful how all these ideas fused and became into one. We see this installation. It's a beautiful installation of golden threads, but I think it becomes something more than just an installation, because as the individual walks inside it, it activates it. You see all these different columns of light that you go around them, but they are very like ethereal columns, but they're still very geometrical, very precise. You see them like perfectly cubical. I don't know, no, what is the cube? One is the cube, one is the cylinder. Well, never mind. You see as a cube, like an elongated cube. It's very precise, it's very geometrical. And it incorporates this idea of the necessity of the viewer to be part of it, and the embodiment of the viewer, which comes back to this idea of anthropophagia and eating our modernity, and eating like what the Europeans were doing at the time. And partly when I was studying their work, it's really frustrating. As I was saying at the beginning, minimalism was a North American movement, and it became at the time a battle between colonies, something like aesthetic colonies, in a sense, a battle that was won at the time by the United States, because despite the fact that all these philosophical turns were happening in Brazil, in New York, but by a Cuban person, all this were happening at the same time, that creating, in a way, the philosophical structure that highlighted the minimalism in the United States. It only became famous because of this other group of artists that made it famous, not only in the art world, but in design, in architecture, and so on and so forth. And all these different people, they are not, in a way, in a sense, they're not minimalists, because they are all created their own subgroups, but the philosophical structure was the same, and they were posing, in a way, similar questions. This is what I wanted to arrive. They were posing questions before them, in a sense, or parallel to them. And of course, those questions were ignored and were all only considered years after, of course, this aesthetics were already part of our visual culture, and we see it every day in our architecture and in our design and everywhere else. So this is something that I found very particular, how these women were doing and were posing the same questions, but were left to the corner of art history. And this is why I wanted to talk about them today. So with this, I finished the work. I think I spoke for 40 minutes. So yes, I give to you to open for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela. That was fascinating. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. I am totally in love with Carmen Herrera's work. It's amazing to see what a pioneer she was. Before I start the Q&A, I just wanted to invite everyone to make a note of our Instagram handle, just in case you're not following us already. It's at Women Artists Latin America. Please share our work with your network, follow us and tag us. We're really grateful for your support. In order for us to keep our content free and accessible to all, we appreciate any donations of any amounts. Please visit the website link, which I will post in the chat in a minute, to learn more about our work, sign up to our newsletter, and to support us. So I've received a few questions over the chat. And whilst you start thinking about your own, I will start firing them away to Daniela. Danny, first question, I think where everyone wants to know is, where can we, when we're allowed out again, where can we see these artists' works in the flesh, in London and abroad? Or if there is anything online that we can learn a bit more about these artists, aside from your fantastic talk?
So I know in London, I know, well, obviously in Brazil, you would see so many pieces of their work, I suppose in New York as well. I know in London because I've seen their work. So you can see both Lygia, you can see this work in London. I'm gonna show you which one. This one you can see in London at the Tate Modern. The one in the left, you can also see in London. Carmen Herrera is in Tate St. Ives. St. Ives, this is how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Ives. And then Carmen Herrera is represented by Lygia Gallery in London. This is not an advertisement for these galleries, but so just so you know. And also Lygia Pape is represented by Hauser and Wirth. So for example, this exhibition that I showed you at the end of Lygia Pape actually occurred in Hauser and Wirth. This installation that she did here, it was replicated year after there. So you can see that there. One of our ideas of actually, this is something better if you see it in the flesh. So once we can go out, we will resume our tours, because we started by giving tours in London and tours around the Tate Modern. So we will resume them once this is all started, if you want to join us.
And then another question is, have they ever worked together or been exhibited together?
Yes, definitely. So Lygia Clark and Lygia Pape for sure, because in a way, as I told you, they co-created this movement called neo-concretism in Brazil with Elio Tisica and other artists. And so they for sure met each other and worked together. Carmen Herrera, no. And in a way, it's funny because they are part of this minority group that is Latin American women. They all get together and align in, oh, they're similar, they are geometrical, so they all get together. And I am getting them together not because they're just geometrical and they're just Latin America, but because in a way the questions that they were posing within their research is what in my mind brought them together. But I don't know if Carmen Herrera and Lygia Clark have been exhibited together. I would need to do that research further.
And just, I will do the penultimate question before I start handing over to our wonderful attendees. Do you have any recommendations for someone who wants to interpret the optical illusion work that you showed us from Carmen Herrera?
So what do you mean?
How can people try and understand it a bit more, or is the point to understand it or just to appreciate it?
Well, in a way, like partly the way that I read it was my interpretation of the work. This is interesting because, as I was telling you before, these are called optical illusions. Illusion means that are like illusions and fiction go together in a way. No, illusion means that they're not there, but actually they are there, because our minds are needed in order to create these works of art. So partly what the concrete artists were trying to do, we're trying to be objective and say an objective thing is like almost pure and non-controversial, whereas if something is subjective, it can be reinterpreted many times. And for me, this is the play of interpretation, or in a way perspective, that we see in this work, because they are objective, they are geometrical, but they are also subjective because they depend on us to see them, to play with them, to move our heads from side to side to see the movement in the work. It requires also our performance. If you see, for example, this work here that you see in the bottom left, is a work that it activates if you move. And it's interesting because it creates a different perspective for the viewer. So for me, this is the interpretation, and it goes in line with what I was saying before about the Gestalt and how our brain like reunites the images and creates a new idea in our brains. So yeah.
Great. So now I'm going to invite Andrea to ask her question.
Hi, Daniela. You mentioned before about Gestalt. You just mentioned it just right now. But did Carmen Herrera actually make part of this German psychology movement?
No. So Gestalt, for me, it's a philosophy. It's a philosophy that started in 1912. So it started like years before. So I'm not saying that she purposely wrote about them or purposely like aligned, like enlisted in their ranks, let's say, but rather she used their concepts in their paintings. As I said to you before, this is a phrase that she actually said. She does, and then she thinks about them. She was an overproductive. She just produced a lot of work. But for me, what made her work distinct is that she was doing certain things in her work that made me think of this. That made me think of this research that happened 20 years before, or 30 years before. Because Carmen Herrera, we need to think that she's a type of woman that you see her today, right now, she's 104, and every day she goes and paints. And in a way, it's an impulse that comes from her. And this is why, like, intellectually she was posing this question with her paintings, but what happened later with minimalists is that they wrote them down and they say, oh, this is how you should interpret my work. But in a way she did that before saying it. She did it with her paintings. I don't know if I'm making myself understood.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. But you know, this image of the two faces is now like a very important image for Gestalt. If you look
Yes.
for Gestalt, it's actually like an icon for it. So it was just curious.
Yeah,
about.
no, absolutely. Like, it's not like she used them like, oh, this image, like purposely. Oh, I want to. It's more the idea of the concept itself, like
No.
this concept of like the two faces and the face right now, right? Is this idea of what do we see as the foreground and what do we see as the background? If we see the vase as a vase, we see white as a background. If we see the two faces, we see black as a background, right? So is this idea that at the end of the day, we are the one that makes that decision. And we are the one that makes that decision based upon like all our processes or our environments that come beforehand. And this is how you see, like in this painting that I wanted to show you here, is the viewer that decides, is the black the background, is the red the foreground, like which one are the two? And the same with the closure that you see in the middle. You see the circle, it's actually created by your brain. Like, what I was trying to suggest is that she was actually using this philosophy without necessarily purposely writing about it and saying, this is what I'm doing. You know what I mean?
Great, thanks.
Now I'm going to hand the mic over to Renata Fernandez. Hi, Renata, lovely to have you here with us. Go ahead and ask your questions.
Hello. Hello.
Hello,
Yes.
Renatilla.
Hola, cariño. Hola, ¿me oyen?
Yes, sí, claro, adelante.
Yeah, well, my question was, it's a curiosity I have for a long time. I mean, Carmen Herrera grew up in Cuba, and when you see the basket weaving of the Caribbeans and other indigenous people, they are very geometric, and I'm saying this, I wonder if Carmen Herrera was, influenced by this, that it was already a very Latin American theme, this geometrism and this minimalism, because recently, there is a Yanomami artist. I mean, he is from a Yanomami. His main language is not Spanish. His name is, I hope I can say it was Sheronawe Hakihiwe. And his work was acquired, a very important piece, very abstract, very minimalist, was acquired by the British Museum as an exemplary work by a indigenous, Yanomami artist. And as such, more than elevated as a work of art. He's been in the circuit of high art for a while, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I always wondered, if Herrera, being the pioneer she is, that she actually had that imprinted during her Cuban upbringing. I wonder, I don't know. What is your opinion about this? Do you know anything about that?
Well, yeah, like, absolutely. I agree with you that in a way we carry ourselves wherever we go. So we don't necessarily let go our roots. And of course, this is a new research that we need to do together, Renata, because of course the influence of like minimal, like geometric abstraction from indigenous tribes in Latin America, it's a new world and a new open door that it would be really interesting to explore. But I do have to admit that, like in her diaries and in her interviews, one of the things that made her this turn towards like more a geometric abstraction was when she saw the works of this concrete artist in Paris in 1948. But it doesn't mean that entirely, because of course she studied in New York and she carried other pieces of work beforehand. So it's a dialogue. I wouldn't say like there was one absolute influence, but I feel like definitely it's a dialogue, and more than that, it's a research that we need to do together.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. So another question is, along with geometry, was repetition important for the development of these artists' work? How did the artists incorporate this action?
Like, absolutely. So I go back to maybe this. And in a way, there's a famous writing of Walter Benjamin in Between Words. It talks about the reproduction of art and what reproduction did to art. Because in a way, if you do a painting and if it's unique and if it's one, it has this type of aura around it, right? But if you can reproduce it many times, it kind of loses the aura and becomes more closer to you. And this type of breaking of the aura was sort of used also, as I mentioned before, during the USSR as a political weapon, in a way, this reproduction of art. So this is why I find it very interesting that, for example, these are prints, but are actually considered in her mind paintings, because she wanted to, again, give this type of aura back. And of course, the repetition worked, because a lot of the work that we see here are kind of explorations of them, of similar explorations, but at the same time, they're trying to be unique and they're trying to create new bodies of work. And in a way, it's a new exploration of the similar through the same, and no, the different through the same. And but again, it's controversial, because of course the reproduction, it kind of, with what I was telling you before with Walter Benjamin, will then be questioned and put into question with the arrival of pop art afterwards. And it became as a political, like not only as a commercial tool, but like trying to play this political game itself through the art world by reproducing the same image over and over again. I don't know if I replied to this question, if that's the angle they were asking.
I think so.
Something else.
And I have a question, if that's all right. As a sculptor, and I know you're a sculptor as well, so I had a question with regard to Lygia Clark's creations.
Features?
Yes. Do you think was the idea that she wanted the viewer to participate and interact with them? Would she be sad to see them now in a museum behind glass?
Yes.
I know that's not obviously sustainable, but what was the idea at the beginning?
Absolutely. And so this work of art, both of them were meant to be touched. Precisely because of what I was telling you before here, and the arrival of the body and the embodiment of work. And I think being and touching and modeling and altering the work of art and giving the viewer the creation of the work, which is like a barrier that had never been crossed before. Like until that time, it was very interesting. If you see like the course of art history, different artists have been made like revolutionary things by incorporating objects of the real world into and made them as a work of art. So the famous one, Duchamp, creating like a toilet and putting it and making it visible. But there was always this distance, and it relates again to this reproduction of art, this aura around the work of art. The work of art was there, and the viewer was here. Whereas in here, there's no longer this aura. The viewer and the work of art become one. Without the viewer and the interaction of the viewer, you lose 99% of the significance of the work. It's sad, again, to see them isolated in the cage, because if you see the rest of the works that Lygia Clark would do the rest of her life were sensory objects. And there's also a very beautiful work of hers where you see like two goggles and people like wearing a goggle together and wearing them and seeing them at the same time. I don't know if I'm making myself understood. So basically it's a goggle that you put with another person. You're both connected, but all you can see are mirrors. So you see yourself looking. So it's very beautiful because all these works are meant to be touched and felt, and that's why she created this cross between sculpture and performance. It was a performance where the viewer needed to be part of. So yes,
great.
That's why I wouldn't call them sculptures either.
No,
they're like
interactive objects.
For sculptor, I don't know.
Well, okay. Thank you so much, Daniela. That was indeed very, very interesting. I hope everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you all for your questions and your interest and for joining us again. As I mentioned at the beginning, this session is recorded, so we will upload the video to our website, where you can also see the last session, which was on Frida Kahlo, Ana Mendieta, and Remedios Varo. I've put our website link in the chat, but it's just in case, it's artamalgama.com. And on our website, you can also sign up to these webinars, you can sign up to our newsletter, and you can support our mission, which, as I said, is really, really greatly received by ourselves as a non-profit, so that we continue to have these sessions and to put out all the information that we're putting out on women artists from Latin America, Spain and Portugal, and to share knowledge with everyone and to support the artists that we're going to be exhibiting in our group exhibition. Hopefully we'll all be allowed out in October to visit it in London. But we will, in the meantime, be uploading posts onto our Instagram of the artists that we have selected for the 2020 show. So please be sure to follow us on Instagram, which is at Women Artists Latin America. The next session will be on another set of inspirational ladies, Tarsila do Amoral, Daniela referenced before, Ana Maria Maiolino, who had an exhibition at Whitechapel Gallery, and Tecla Tofano. So we hope you can join us then, and wishing you all a lovely evening. Thank you again. Stay safe and stay inspired. Good night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.